Joining us now, the Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann from Perth. Minister, thanks for your time. The former Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, has said overnight that the Ausgrid decision, he believes, reflects domestic political pressure and what he's described as the witch's brew of xenophobia and economic nationalism that we've seen emerge in the Senate in the wake of the election, not national security. What's your response to that?
Well, he's completely wrong and obviously ignorant of the facts. The Treasurer went through a very thorough process, as is the responsibility under our Foreign Investment Review Board framework, our Foreign Investment Review framework. And the reality is Australia does need foreign investment for our future economic development, as we have in the past, and for our future economic success. But it is always important to assess any foreign investment proposals, in particular when they relate to key infrastructure servicing business and government, to ensure that any such proposal is not contrary to the national interest. The Treasurer formed a preliminary view. The two proposals in front of the government, these proponents now have the opportunity to provide submissions in relation to how the identified risks to our national security could be mitigated, and the process continues in the usual and ordinary way.
But how can they respond if they don't know the risks? The Treasurer says that he hasn't even been able to share the national security concerns explicitly with the Australian public. One would presume he hasn't given the exact details either to the bidders, has he?
Well, there's been extensive consultation. I mean, this process runs in the usual way. It's not a political decision-making process. It is.
So they do know. They're aware of it.
Well, this is a process that runs in the usual way. There's been extensive consultation, obviously, with the New South Wales government. Appropriate information has been provided to the bidders, and they have a week to provide further information, and after that the Treasurer will make his final decision. But I mean, the important point here is this has got nothing to do with the country of origin of the proponents. I mean, whatever country of origin these particular foreign investment proposals would have come from, the reality is that Ausgrid is a key power and communications piece of infrastructure, providing important and essential services to business and to government, and this was always going to be a very important assessment process, and the Treasurer is fulfilling his responsibilities.
So if it was an American company,
legislation.
If it was an American company or a British company, the same decision would have been made?
Well, that is as I understand it. Look, obviously this is something that the facts of this matter and the risks involved are a matter for the Treasurer to assess. He's got all of the information in front of him. He's obviously assisted by the Foreign Investment Review Board. The important point here is that this is business as usual, but we've got to remind ourselves we're talking here about a very important piece of key power and communications infrastructure, and this is what the Australian people would expect us to do, and that is of course what the government is doing.
So Pauline Hanson and that sort of view of the world in terms of economic nationalism and xenophobia isn't having an impact already on government policy?
No. Well, that's a ridiculous proposition, and as I say, Bob Carr is. Well, I mean, this is what I'm saying. Bob Carr is ignorant of the facts. He's wrong, and he should know better than make such ridiculous statements, quite frankly. I mean, the Foreign Investment Review Board, obviously, which advises the Treasurer, assesses these sorts of proposals very thoroughly in a non-political fashion. I mean, the only consideration here is whether a particular foreign investment proposal is or isn't contrary to the national interest.
Now, the Chinese have reacted. Well, there's certainly the Hong Kong-based company asking why us, given they've got various interests in Australia, many interests in Australia already, not the least of which the power industry in South Australia, gas industry as well in Australia. Why is Ausgrid different to all of those?
Well, as I say, this is, I mean, Ausgrid obviously is a particularly important piece of power and communications infrastructure, and as I understand it, it goes to the nature of the way the transaction was structured and proposed. It goes to some specific national security concerns that were identified through the process. I mean, this is a preliminary review. There is now a an opportunity for the proponents to make further submissions, and obviously that process now is to take its course.
But the Treasurer seemed to indicate that they didn't have much of a chance to mitigate against the national security concerns. He seemed to be playing down the prospect of them being able to do that in the week given them.
Well, I mean, that's not quite what the Treasurer said. What the Treasurer said is that the Treasurer hasn't been able to identify ways to mitigate relevant risks that have been identified so far, and there has been an extensive process already so far. But there is now a process to take place, and obviously we're not going to preempt what the outcome will be, because we don't know what will be in those submissions.
Your colleague Christopher Pyne seemed to confirm this morning that it was elements within Australia that disrupted the census with that DDoS earlier in the week, disruption of service of the census website. Is that true? Is that what the government's being told now, that it was elements within Australia, not overseas, as the chief statistician seemed to say earlier in the week?
Well, I mean, earlier in the week there was obviously a massive failure. It was the ABS which decided to take down the census website. There's now a review which will take place by the government's cybersecurity advisor, Alistair McGibbon. I'm not going to preempt the findings of the review. I mean, as I understand it, there was some abnormal traffic that was detected in the network, and the ABS, in an abundance of caution, decided to take down the website on the night. I mean, this is obviously was a massive failure. That impacted on every Australian household, including myself, and this will have to be properly and dispassionately assessed to ensure that we know exactly what happened.
But it seems Mr Pyne's confirmed it was Australian elements. It wasn't a foreign adversary or foreign hackers as expected initially, that it was Australian elements. And he would know, as Defence Industry Minister, he'd received briefings from the Australian Signals Directorate. He seems to have confirmed that this morning.
Well, I'm not going to speak for Christopher Pyne. Christopher Pyne obviously is able to speak for himself. In my area of portfolio responsibility, I don't have line of sight in relation to the matters that you are raising.
I want to ask you about the result in the Senate now. Because it's a double dissolution election, it needs to be decided which senators will serve 6 year term, and which senators will only serve a 3-year term and be up for re-election at the normal half-Senate election next time we go to the polls. How will the government decide that? Will the major parties simply gang up against the crossbenchers here to lock in the 6-year terms and leave the 3 years for Pauline Hanson and co?
Well, this is not a decision for the government, it's a decision for the Senate. I mean, the Constitution requires for the Senate, after a double dissolution election, to essentially split senators elected in the states in half, and to determine which senators sit for the longer 6-year period and which senators sit for a 3-year period. And that has happened on 7 occasions before since Federation, and on each occasion the way this has been settled is on the basis of the order in which individual senators were elected to the Senate in their respective states. So 12 senators are elected in every state. Under the methodology used on every occasion so far, the first 6 senators elected would get 6 years, whoever they are and whichever party they represent, and the last 6, the bottom 6 out of the 12
they're mostly the minor parties, aren't they? The last 6, so that it would see the major parties lock in the 6 years.
Well, I don't think that is right in an absolute sense. I mean, I think you'll find that there is a variation between individual states. For example, I think that the Nick Xenophon team would have at least 1 or if not 2 senators elected in the top 6 using the traditional method. But I mean, the important point is, I mean, obviously this is a function of how many votes and how many preferences you are able to attract. If you are elected in the first 6 out of 12, then it stands to reason that you were elected earlier, and as such, you qualify for the longer period.
Finance Minister Matthias Cormann, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Always good to talk to you.